So today we talk about the mandate of heaven and Confucius. So the mandate of heaven, tianming, is a most intriguing concept and gives rise to a lot of confusion, as it seems to indicate the belief in a transcendent realm which is over and above and quite different from the present realm in which we live. But there is quite another matter of importance about the mandate of heaven, and that is the fact that it raises again the question of Confucius, the subversive, as it concerns the transition of political power. The mandate of heaven predates Confucius, the term and the thinking around it, and it arises from politics prior to his time. It's been compared to the idea of the divine right of kings, as it was in Western Europe. You will recall this idea through the words, "The king is dead, long live the king." In other words, the institution carries on, though the bodies of the mere mortals who occupy the kingship have ceased to function. But in addition to the idea of the continuity of the institution, which resists death and destruction of all kinds, there was the idea that this institution was divinely ordained. And this still survives, at least in the language of the monarchy. The French Revolution saw it find its end in France, though monarchists still exist even there. The Western idea of the institution of kingship was outlined in a hugely important work called The King's Two Bodies by Ernst Kantorowicz. This is a study in political theology. In the case of Chinese dynastic rule, the Zhou Dynasty developed the idea of the mandate of heaven, partly to justify their replacement of the previous dynasty, the Shang Dynasty, whom they'd overthrown. It was an attempt at self-divinization, creating a myth of origin which gave them legitimacy and suggested to the people that the transition from the Shang Dynasty was meant to happen and had the blessing of heaven. The Zhou Dynasty then ruled from 1046 BC to 256 BC. The doctrine of the mandate of heaven, or tian, heaven is tian, tianming, became surprisingly portable, and was, by comparison with the divine right of kings as understood in Europe, surprisingly flexible. If a regime became corrupt and fell to an invader, who then reduced corruption, filled the granaries, and attended to the irrigation channels, then the mandate of heaven was seen to apply to that new ruler. Virtue or goodness was important in this, in that the entitlement to the mandate of heaven could be challenged should the rulers become ineffective and corrupt. And this is where someone like Confucius comes in, with his emphasis on goodness, as expressed in his own way, goodness being the requisite humaneness or benevolence, respect for ritual, and the right path. His emphasis on the right path could conceivably turn into a challenge to the claim to own the mandate of heaven. Turning back to the idea of heaven itself, we are familiar in the West with a Judeo-Christian idea of another plane of existence, invisible, unreachable, and of course far above us. Height is the metaphor for superiority, and the heights are the appropriate abode for divinity. The idea of heaven, or Uranos in ancient Greek, was based on early cosmology. Heaven was the arch which was thought to cover the world, and to this arch were attached the stars. Ancient Greeks and Jews thought of heaven as a kind of tent covering and protecting the earth. And the Greek ideas infiltrated Judaism and Christianity. Plato equates Uranos with the all, the cosmos, but the image of height remains dominant. Consequently, any kind of spiritual progress or intellectual progress was seen as a kind of ascent, going upwards towards the ethereal destination above. So it would seem that with the early idea of the mandate of heaven, as adopted by the Zhou Dynasty, there was a sense of transcendence coming to earth, just as we have it in Christianity. Yet the idea of transcendence, the idea of the heavenly injecting itself into the earthly, does not seem to be present in Confucius at all. His emphasis is more on nature, the social world, and what brings harmony to the social world. But that is never an outside force. It comes from within society. There is nothing resembling the idea of the transcendent becoming immanent. That's immanent. The idea of God becoming man in order to save us. As the Zhou Dynasty began to fail and began to be seen to be inadequate in the way in which it served the population, there came to be some disillusionment with the heaven, or tian, which had endowed the people with this regime. Yet Confucius and his followers do not turn against the idea of heaven and its mandate, but they do seek to know what the way of heaven really is. And with this comes a set of questions about the standards of their dynastic rulers. In Analects 2:4 we have a famous passage. The master said, "From 15 my heart and mind was set upon learning. From 30 I took my stance. From 40 I was no longer doubtful. From 50 I realized the propensities of the mandate of heaven. And from 60 my ear was attuned. And from 70 I could give my heart and mind free rein without overstepping the boundaries." The mandate of heaven is here treated by Confucius as something he found after a long search, and it took him until the age of 50. This means that it was not freely available, and it was not an obvious set of doctrines which he could have absorbed as a 15-year-old when his heart was set on learning. Why did it take so long? Clearly, there is something not obvious about the way of the mandate of heaven, and it is understood only after a long passage through the pathway of life. So the mandate of heaven is no longer a piece of public rhetoric with a clear meaning, with a visible meaning to the eye of the public. In fact, what he's doing is taking the public political language and giving it another meaning. The real mandate of heaven, he says, is the way. But there are no simple definitions given by Confucius, and understanding the way is always difficult. It may even be the case that there was a political necessity to be opaque and to speak in riddles. If so, it would not be the first time, as the early Christians, prior to the acceptance of Christianity in the Roman Empire, were concerned to write in riddles when they put pen to paper, lest their letters fall into the hands of somebody who would be prepared to denounce them. So Confucius gives himself the task of defining or redefining the mandate of heaven, and with this he is maintaining the old language and the old doctrines, but simply saying that their moral core has been lost. In this respect, he is a challenger, not unlike the prophets of the Old Testament who recall the Jewish people to the true understanding of Yahweh. I've partly used the translation of Ames and Rosemont above, and it's worth noting that their English translation contains the word propensities. If this translation is correct, then at the age of 50, Confucius understands the propensities of the mandate of heaven, meaning that he's not yet understood it all, but that he has seen the capacities which it opens up. So in a sense, he claims to be still on a learning voyage of discovery and of development, and at 60, he is attuned. One can easily see that Confucius could be regarded as subversive of the established order if he so readily declared that the meaning of the mandate of heaven was unclear and hard to discover. He might have even been regarded as quite dangerous. Just this very fact that he argued for the idea that it was difficult to know might have been enough to make him suspect. There is another issue here. Scholars have pushed towards the idea that Confucius' transformation of the mandate of heaven tends to make it less metaphysical or spiritual, and tends to focus it on the pragmatic need for social harmony and the behavioural requirements for this to exist. So that on this reading, heaven is seen really as nothing more than the state of a harmonious and successfully functioning society. It is a case of nothing buttery, as I was taught to say in undergraduate philosophy. Heaven is nothing but the harmonious society. Nothing more exists beyond that. And this is indeed a perplexing thing, because all Confucius' attention goes towards social obligations, duties, and respectful behaviours. Despite this, there are some passages in which he seems to use the word almost with a Judeo-Christian equivalence. In Analects 7:23, he says that heaven has endowed him with virtue, and he has nothing to fear from other people, whom he names. This seems to suggest the hand of transcendence laying itself upon him, with a capacity ordained from above. In another passage, he says that heaven never speaks, but puts the world in motion. Analects 17:19, the master responded, "Does heaven speak? And yet the four seasons turn, and the myriad things are born and grow within it." He seems to be saying that we should not expect words from above, words from heaven, but it will turn the wheels of nature and the cosmos, so that the cycle of birth and growth will occur. This almost sounds like the old Greek cosmological idea of the role of heaven, and as if there is some kind of agency above us. Now, one could say that this is simply archaic language and that he's being poetic. But there is a tendency in the scholarship to want to save Confucius from himself, to prevent him sounding like a religious believer, and to make him a pure secularist, focused only on social realities and their natural context. Sometimes modern philosophers do this with Plato, try to save him from himself, save him from his mistakes, and accordingly de-emphasize the embarrassing bits which seem to suggest that he may have had a deep spiritual life, or that he was a bit theatrical. So let us hope this is not happening to Confucius, that there is no swift trip to the barber shop to tidy him up a bit. So thank you for joining me, and next time we will look at the mandate of heaven in the later Confucian thinker Mencius.